Hi, my name is Todd Leonard.
And my name is Herb Montgomery, and we're just talking.
Before we get started, if you just do us a favor and hit the like button and the subscribe button if you want to follow us, and then if you would appreciate a reminder, click that bell icon for us.
Thanks, Todd. Each week, we're going to be talking about the upcoming gospel lectionary reading for whatever the upcoming weekend is, and we're going to be doing that. We're going to talk about those texts in the context of love and inclusion and societal justice. And our hope is that our talking will be just talking in the sense of justice, but that something that is said during this short time together as we speak, something will inspire you possibly to do more than just talking.
So we're glad to have you here with us tonight. We are continue to be in the Gospel of John, and this week we're in chapter 11, the great story about Jesus resurrecting Lazarus from the dead. And I think we'll have some fun with this subject and hope it is meaningful and informative for you as you are studying the scriptures and perhaps planning to teach and preach on this weekend. So, Herb, why don't you start us and let's get into this?
Yeah, I think the first thing is that the the version of this story that we find in the Gospel of John is not the only version of this story that we know of. That like the secret Gospel of Mark, secret Mark, it has another version of this story. And the reason I bring that up to begin with is that I think we need to lay a foundation as we're talking tonight, that whatever we say about this particular version of the story in John, this is the Johannine communities, that proto-Gnostic version of the Lazarus story, the resurrection story of the gentleman in Bethesda, for their own narrative purposes. And we're going to see some of those tensions there. But again, for those of you, maybe this is your first episode that you're watching, the Gospel of John, all the Gospels, none of the Gospels were written by the name that's attached to them. And the Gospel of John specifically came out of the Johannine community. And whether they were Gnostic or not, you can see a lot of views in the Gospel of John that would later evolve into Gnosticism, or if you, some scholars call it proto-Gnosticism. Whether they were proto-Gnostic, whether they were Gnostic or not, they at least wrote a gospel that was vulnerable or easily adaptable to Gnosticism later. Irenaeus talks about how the Valentinians, the later Gnostics, they would only read the Gospel of John. They wouldn't read the other Gospels. So tonight, what we're going to be doing is bumping into, once again, some of those proto-Gnostic Johannine community ways of looking at Jesus and ways of looking at the world as they bump into Jewish apocalypticism. Up until this week, we've been seeing how the Johannine proto-Gnostic views, how they interacted with other kind of anti-Jewish, anti-Gnostic communities like the Pharisees and others. But tonight we're going to be bumping into the Johannine community and their attitude toward, or their interaction with, Jewish apocalypticism. So there's a lot to talk about. I don't think it'll take very long to cover it, but there's a lot. There's a lot right here that's worth looking at.
Mm. And I appreciate that you brought in the secret gospel of Mark. And just for anybody who wants to check this out, I mean, just Google the secret gospel of Mark and you can find it. It's not a lot. There's just a fragment of that, but there's a couple of fragments that plug in, that are plugged into a couple places in Mark, and a Lazarus story that has a number of similarities and some differences is that shows up there. But even when you're looking at the secret edition of Mark, you're still looking probably at something that was written before John's gospel was written. Is that correct, Herb?
At least in the same ballpark. We don't know for sure. I mean, that's
Okay.
the debate, is when these things were actually written.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
this and Secret Mark has had a ton of kind of scandal around it, even in modern scholarship. But the whole point in bringing that up is not Secret Mark had it right,
Right.
but just to show that there were different versions of this story in the Jesus community.
Hmm.
And the one that we're encountering tonight is the Johannine community's version of it. We're going to find some little Johannine stuff thrown in there for their narrative goals.
Yeah. I mean, we're taking, like everything, we're taking oral tradition, and then at some point, whatever community gets down and actually writes this down is now writing down what has been floating in the oral tradition for at least 60, 70 years, at least, if not, more than that. And
If not longer, with John.
with John, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, so that's that anyway. That I think that's always good to point out is when we're looking at these things, we're looking at w- stories, wisdom, monologues that have existed in the oral tradition for a significant length of time, and it's not being created fresh when it's being written down in ink. It's something that's taking stuff that's been out there for quite a while and then using it to accomplish a specific agenda. And with John, it is
Mhm.
the proto-Gnostic agenda that they have. So, all right,
Yeah.
well, let's go on from
Yeah.
there.
The first thing we bump into is this Jewish apocalypticism. And if there are those of you out there that you're unfamiliar with Jewish apocalypticism, apocalypticism viewed the world dualistically. No, there was another way of looking at the world dualistically. Proto-Gnostics did too, but apocalypticists, they looked at the world dualistically. There was this world, and then there was the unseen cosmos with the powers that be, and there were good guys in this world and bad guys in this world. And the good guys, they were connected to the good cosmic forces, and the bad guys were connected to the bad cosmic forces. And the biggest thing was that apocalypticism believed that it was kind of pessimistic. There's nothing really you can do about changing the world much. All you can do is hope for that day that's coming, the apocalypse, when all the just injustice, all the violence, all of the oppression in the world would be put right. And they believed that at that time, those that had died would be resurrected. They didn't believe much like we do, like many Christians do today, rather, like that the Christian belief of dying and immediately going somewhere else. They believe that when you died, you slept in the dust of the earth, and you were asleep. You find this in Ecclesiastes and some other passages. And but the hope was that one day you would be resurrected. An example of this is Daniel 12 verse 1, an infamous apocalyptic passage. It says that at that time, Michael, the great prince who protects your people, will arise. There will be a time of darkness such as not happened from the beginning of the nations until then. But at that time, your people, everyone whose name is found written in the book, will be delivered. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, and others to shame and everlasting contempt. So it's that idea of resurrection. And Martha and Mary both, they symbolize these Jewish apocalyptic ways of viewing the world in our story this week. Martha says, Jesus says to Martha, your brother will rise again. And Martha says, well, sure, I know he'll rise again in the
Hmm.
resurrection at the last day. That's
Hmm.
Jewish apocalypticism. And then you get the Johannine response to that, which we can talk about in a minute.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think for a lot of Christians to be confronted with what you're looking at here in these gospel stories. And again, these gospel stories written, well past, again, 100 or more years in John's case past the life of Jesus, and he is bringing this account back into this viewpoint back into focus. That this is clearly what was the common understanding among a lot of Jewish people of that time, was not a soul going up into the afterlife, but that a literal restored world, even the idea of going back to the Garden of Eden that you see in Genesis, as kind of reverse, uh, or renewal rather, of of the world as it's supposed to be and to take place here.
Mhm.
There's no streets of gold up in a place far, far away in the universe. It's all happening right back here on the earth. I think it's fascinating for I think to see that concept and to see that concept coming right face to face with Jesus.
There is a large sector of Judaism during this time that did not believe in life after death. You
Hmm.
died, but the hope was that during this time at last day, those who had died righteously would be resurrected during that time when all injustice is put right and
Hmm.
the world is transformed.
We have some
So
sense.
again, that's go
Yeah, I
ahead.
mean, there's some sense in the Jewish writings, Hebrew writings of the Hebrew scriptures, where you have this concept of Sheol, the idea that maybe there is this kind of nebulous netherworld that people go to, and it's either the grave where people die and that's it, or for some people, again, it was a place of not really living but not really
Mm-hmm.
dead as well. You have some of that going on. And then
Yeah,
as you
Judaism
get
was not
closer,
monolithic.
no.
Was not
And
monolithic during this time.
and it was actually, if I correct me if I'm wrong, her, but the Pharisees was one of the core groups of people who did very much believe in a resurrection, and that was one of
In a
the conflicts you
resurrection.
had
Yeah.
between Pharisees and Sadducees. Sadducees did not believe in a resurrection, and Pharisees did, which is interesting in the context of, again, this passage where we've looked in weeks prior about how anti-Pharisee the Gospel of John is. Um, and yet here again, it seems there is this coming together of, and I think we'll see that John is going to try to shift it, but it's a
It's a hard
hard
row to
puzzle to
hoe.
try to make fit. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I think this community does their best to say to the apocalyptic community, you don't have to wait for a resurrection.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus is the answer today, now. And
Mm-hmm.
and that's what Jesus says to Martha next. He says, "No, Martha, you don't have to wait till the resurrection. I am the resurrection and
Mm-hmm.
the life." And this language those who believe in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. The original language here is Martha says basically, um, if you'd been here, the Greek here is not my brother would not have died. It's this same phrase that Jesus uses. It's my brother would never have died. But now he
Mm-hmm.
has because you weren't here. And Jesus says he'll live again, kind of like, yeah, but there's a backup plan, right? There's a second option. And she says, yeah, I know, at that resurrection. And Jesus says, no, I'm the resurrection and life. But this attitude is that we can transform death even. And again, this was the Johannine proto Gnostic view that
Mm-hmm.
through the gnosis that Jesus came to offer, death can be transformed from a resting place or a place of termination to kind of like this portal. Remember, the Gnostics believed that it was at death that the soul was liberated from the material
Mm-hmm.
imprisonment of your
Mm-hmm.
embodiment and all this world of suffering. And
Mm-hmm.
so, I mean, if you put it together, Martha's saying, if you'd have been here, my brother would have never died. Well, of course he would have died, but not in the Gnostics' worldview. That's
Right.
just transition. And Jesus says, well, he'll live again. Martha references her apocalypticism. I know, at the resurrection. And Jesus says, no, I am the resurrection of life. So what they're doing is it appears that whoever wrote this is trying to present this proto-Gnostic Jesus and transforming life into or death into a portal rather than a resting place.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, 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 they're trying to present this in
Mm-hmm.
contrast to um, Jewish Gnosticism. I don't know if
Mm-hmm.
anybody out there follows Wilbur Gaffney, but I'm just here to tell you that if you're listening to anybody out there, you should be listening to Gaffney. Her work is phenomenal. She's the author of A Woman's Lectionary for the Whole Church. And I'm going to be reading from her comment for just a second, a couple sentences from Year W. This is page 185. She wrote, Martha's statement to Jesus in John 11:21 is stonier than it has often been translated. Not my brother would not have died, but my brother would never have died. The same never is included by Jesus in his response. Everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. That speaks to me of death as portal to eternal life, not a permanent estate. And she's exactly right about what the language hints, because that's what the Johannine community viewed death
Mm-hmm.
as. They're
Mm-hmm.
trying to present Jesus now as the source of this life-giving gnosis that can transform even death itself
Mm-hmm.
into just a transition to a higher existence.
And
It's
and
thorny.
again, and with that is there's the question is, where will you transition? There is, I mean, there is in some places at this by this point, I believe in Christianity and this, and also to some degree in Judaism, the same apocalyptic imagery of a heaven and a hell, some form of
Right.
that. And so the whole point of the Gnostic viewpoint is it's not just, hey, we'll give you the gateway to the afterlife, we'll give you the gateway to the good afterlife.
Yes.
We're giving you that secret knowledge that you need, and Jesus is that secret knowledge. And I think there's other elements in John 11 that kind of, I think, diminish uh, the 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 material world that you see Jesus was not worried about getting to Lazarus before he died.
Right.
That's
Let's let
not
him
a
die
concern
so
of
the gnosis
his.
can be revealed.
And so yeah, and so he's very nonchalant in his approach
Mm,
coming in. Although on the other side, then he breaks down and weeps,
right.
which is the other side of that. But again, I think that probably as much likely comes from other source material, and it's
The original version or something.
right, because it seems like a lot of what John brings in, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think is in the secret Mark detail. Jesus does not seem to have the nonchalance in the
Oh,
secret
no, not at
Gospel of
all.
Mark. He seems to be
Not at
quite
all.
urgent about it and distressed about it when he gets there.
Correct.
So there seems to be a different approach, and so this nonchalance speaks to the same thing of, the physical body doesn't matter anyway. This is not secondary. I mean, this is secondary. Um,
And
I can do what
and
I
I
want.
realize,
I'm done.
yeah, yeah, and I realize the narrative point that the Gnostics are trying to twist this story into making. Um, but it doesn't rest on all fours in the end, because if I was a Jewish apocalypticist, I would say to my proto-Gnostic brothers, sisters, siblings, I would say, if this material existence is so bad and we're trying to, the goal is to escape the body and get, through the portal of death to some higher plane, why did Jesus rip him out of that and bring him
Right,
back into that material existence? So the
right.
story, I understand they're taking an older story and trying to use it for a theological point today, but it doesn't work really well. It doesn't work well at all, in my opinion.
Yeah. And something that's interesting with John is a well-structured book. Despite everything that Herb and I want to have our issues with the book of John, I think that's been clear. It's a
It's
well-structured
a
book.
literary masterpiece.
It's very well done. And this is the seventh miracle that John brings up, and he brings up the biggest, the most powerful miracle, he brings it up here, and so it fits well from him building the drama, building his evidence for why Jesus is the Messiah, by bringing this story in, because he triumphs over death. And I think, and maybe what the Gnostics' argument back against what you just said, Herb, would be, but his point was not really about bringing him back into the world. Again, he wasn't concerned about that because he knew what where Lazarus would be going otherwise. But
Right.
again, like
Yeah.
with last week when we talked about the blind man being born blind according to Jesus, so that the glory of God could be revealed by doing that miracle. This story, Lazarus is being used again
Mm-hmm.
to show that Jesus has control over death and life. And so even that is not an obstacle to him. And so they would say this is, he goes against where the trajectory that Lazarus was on, which was escaping the material body. But he, for this purpose of showing everybody else and proving to everybody else who he was, he's going to yank Lazarus back into this physical existence, so that people believe. And the Gospel of John concludes by saying many people did believe.
Right. And two, I mean, to capitalize on that pinnacle, that this being the seventh miracle, the seventh, sign that that Jesus is the Gnostic savior. In the other gospels, the reason Jesus is arrested and executed is because of his social justice protest in the temple courts. They're overturning the tables. But in the Gospel of John, that's already happened back at the beginning of John. The whole reason Jesus is arrested and executed is not because of his protest against the exploitation of the poor, like in the other gospels. It's because Jesus's gnosis, Jesus has the power to transform even death itself. I mean, just a few verses later in John 11, same chapter, it says, from that day, they began to plot how to kill him. They were, anyway, it's all about Jesus being the one that can take death and now use it as, instead of it being something to be afraid of or something to be endured like the apocalypse taught, it can be a portal. It can be a passage to a higher existence. And I know we have all kinds of different views within even Christianity about what happens when a person dies. I've got my own view. I'm not going to share that tonight. But I think what this at least shows is that within the New Testament, there's room for us all, regardless of where on the journey we are. We can have, the fact is, none of us have died and come back to tell about it. So none of us really know without saying, I just have an idea. You know what I mean? So I think when something falls into that category, once that theological stuff, we need to give a wide berth, for a big tent, for all of it. As long as we're doing justly, loving mercy, and walking humbly, we can have differences on these other issues.
Right. I mean, the concern that you and I have with the whole Gnostic approach is it seems to not care about the issues that affect the material world. And so our problem with that
at least
is
diminishes.
At least. And I think that's our concern in general with the Gnostic approach of John, is that it becomes this pathway for people to say, I can believe in Jesus, and the material world stuff that's going on, the environmental disasters, the injustices that are done to different groups of people, different nationalities of people, the war in Ukraine, all these things are all just things that have to pass before but my security is in what's going to happen to me when I die, or even like the Jewish apocalypticists at the end when God makes everything right, whatever it is,
resurrects.
It's this current earth trajectory is not savable. It's not fixable. It's really not worth my time. this is the stuff that this is why we really struggle with John and really push back against what John is doing, because of how it's played out in Christianity for so long. But on the point of understanding what happens at death and in the afterlife, I completely agree with you. There is, honestly, whatever brings comfort to you is really what's most important in that, because our hope is that, I think, for most of us in the Christian faith, our hopes have been at certainly at for most of our lives have been in the area that somehow, some way, there is something on the other side of the grave, and it brings a lot of comfort to us, especially when a loved one passes away. And so, however you hold on to that, I think that there's good reason to hold on to that as you wrestle with what happens beyond the grave. And I think what this passage and other passages of Jesus is truly the author of life, is the one who brings life to those who are having it less fully, to, in the Lazarus case, who no longer had life. But we we hold on to Jesus as life giver, whatever that looks like, and however that will play out in the days to come.
And I think that's how we can even reclaim this story in the Gospel of John in John 11, is that the point for the Gnostics is that Jesus triumphs over death. And I would say today, and I want to give a little shout out, you shouted who take hope in the afterlife. I want to also give a shout out to the Christian atheists that are out there, and that might be an oxymoron for some of you, but there is such a thing as Christian atheism. They don't believe in an afterlife, but they do value the ethical teachings of Jesus. The values that they find in the Jesus story. And so, again, regardless of what your belief is about the afterlife, whether you believe in one or not, what you believe about one, if you believe in one, the whole point, I think, for Todd and I both, is not what you believe about death, but what you're doing in this life today. How are you living justly in the here and in the now? That's really the Jewish wisdom that's always been there in these stories. And John, again, the way we can reclaim this is that Jesus triumphs over death. What it says to me is that taking it out of the Gnostic intention and pulling it back into possibly an intention that we would have found in Matthew, Mark, or Luke, that the teachings of Jesus, they have the power to transform us into human beings with hope. And our hope is that love can actually conquer and reverse hate, that justice can triumph over injustice, that those things that are life-giving are actually more powerful than those things that are death-dealing. It speaks to me that our best inclinations as human beings can win out over our worst inclinations. We can replace exclusion and privilege with inclusion and equality. We can replace hierarchies with egalitarianism. We can replace bigotry and fear with things like celebration and celebrating the diversity that we find in the human race. Boy, I was just reminded that you live in Southern California, Todd. We don't hear that here in rural West Virginia often. But but again,
life keeps moving, man.
Speaking of life conquering death, that's really what this story speaks about. Whether you're a proto-Gnostic or whether you're just a Jesus follower, you still believe that there's something intrinsically valuable in what Jesus was about that has the power to be life-giving in the face of those things that are death-dealing. And that, especially as we're moving into the Easter season soon, I think that's where the hope of this story is. There's something redeemable in this story about that. This story is lost on most of us today. We don't believe, many don't believe in life after death. Many, you know what I'm saying? And those that do believe in life after death, many of us wouldn't believe that you could bring someone back to life after being dead for 4 days.
Right. Right.
So, I mean, there's a lot there that I think can get lost because of our worldview today.
Mm-hmm.
But the point, the original intention of the story, I think we can still reap something valuable out of, which is to hold on to those things that are life giving, that they actually do have the power to turn things around and bring healing and restoration and inclusion. And especially, I don't know what it's like around the rest of the planet, but at least here in the United States, boy, we need a message like that right now.
Mm.
There's a lot that needs to be turned back that's been
Mm.
set in motion.
Yeah.
A lot of
Uh,
death dealing stuff.
yeah. And that's this is and that should not be accepted. It should not be accepted as the norm. And that's why the
Mm-hmm.
gospel of Jesus is so important today, and a story of resurrection is so important today, because there is we take war as a necessary evil that has to be done sometimes. We take overreach by our law enforcement as necessary. We take raping the land for our agriculture as necessary. And we just had a law in Uganda passed this week of life in prison and death for LGBTQ people in order to keep it from spreading.
Oh my God.
These things, this is not how we should accept. This is not something to be accepted. This is something to be fought against with life and love, rather than just living in a death mindset. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about this passage is Jesus says to Mary and Martha, don't stay in the death mindset, but move
Mm-hmm.
to the life mindset, move to what I can do, move to what we all can do in works of healing and restoration. Uh, this is our call. This is what we're about.
Yeah, I love that. Where the proto-Gnostics would say, follow Jesus, and the gnosis he gives can transform even death itself into life. I would say following Jesus puts us in touch with how to live. Specifically, we're talking about the golden rule, loving your enemy, nonviolence. Some of those more the key resource
Mm-hmm.
sharing, mutual aid, and wealth redistribution, those types of things that they have the power to overcome the way of death that many of our societies and communities are on today, that they can overturn. If we define life and death that way, then I can totally get behind life overcoming death.
Yeah.
And a lot of these ethics, at least the ones that I mentioned tonight, are found in the Jesus story, put on the lips of Jesus, that Jesus is the one teaching them. So again, following that Jesus
Yeah.
has the ability to put us on a path for things that are life-giving, that can overcome those things that are death-dealing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, man.
That's what I
I
got
think
tonight, Todd.
that's our show. That's what we got for you. We sure like doing it. Hope you enjoyed watching it. And Herb, why don't you tell us where we can find you?
Sure. And again, if you do like what you're seeing each week, leave us a comment there in the comments section.
And if you don't,
And yeah, and if you see something we can be doing better, tell us that too. Todd and I have pretty thick skin. We can handle it. So again, thank you for watching tonight. You can find me at Herb Montgomery at renewedheartministries.com.
and you can find me at toddjleonard.com or on my church website at glendalecitychurch.org. Thanks again, everybody. Hope you're doing well. All the best to you, and peace. Good night.
We'll see you next week.